You stop reacting and start responding. At first, when someone hurts you or leaves you behind, there's a natural human instinct to react. It's almost primal, the sudden rush of adrenaline, the racing thoughts, the overwhelming desire to either lash out or cling tighter. That reaction is driven by emotional turbulence, by unresolved questions, by the subconscious need to be acknowledged, validated, or seen. But when you truly let go, not halfway, not as a tactic to get a response, not as a silent protest, but when you fully detach at the core of your nervous system, something radical shifts within you. You're no longer a puppet being yanked by the strings of unpredictability or manipulation. You're no longer operating on emotional impulse, jumping every time a notification appears, decoding hidden meanings in their silence, or rereading old texts hoping to find answers you never received. You don't chase clarity from the person who broke your peace. You begin to understand that your value doesn't exist in their recognition, but in your ability to maintain stillness in the face of chaos. This shift is not loud, it's not performative, it's subtle, deep, and incredibly powerful. You stop flinching at their games. They might post something indirect, hoping to provoke a response. They might drop a breadcrumb, a vague message, a nostalgic song, a like on an old photo, all carefully calculated to remind you that they're still watching, but you don't bite, not because you're trying to play it cool, but because their presence no longer dictates your emotional temperature. You don't feel the need to match their energy to stay relevant in their world. You've exited the arena. You've moved your focus inward. And when your focus shifts inward, you start operating from a place of sovereignty. The same words that once triggered you now feel empty. The silence that used to scream now feels like music. The urge to explain yourself, to be understood, to fix things. It vanishes. You begin to realize that the most powerful answer is no answer. The strongest reaction is stillness. And stillness, when it's real, becomes your new default. You don't need revenge. You don't need to prove you're over it. You don't even need them to notice your silence. You're not withholding to get a reaction. You're not ignoring them to appear strong. You've simply unplugged. You've taken your emotional energy back and redirected it to your growth, your peace, your power. You stop living in a constant state of emotional surveillance. No more watching what they post. No more checking if they viewed your story. No more hoping that silence is their version of an apology. Instead of reacting to what they do or don't do, you respond only to what aligns with your purpose. You're deliberate. Every word, every action, every movement comes from a place of control, not impulse. You understand now that emotional control is not suppression. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about choosing not to let what doesn't matter disrupt your peace. From a Stoic point of view, you step into the sacred space between stimulus and response. That space is where your real power lies. Before, they could hijack your whole day with one comment, one ghosting episode, one passive-aggressive jab. But now they have no access. They don't get to determine whether you feel good today. They don't get to steal your focus. They don't get to interrupt your calm, because now you choose how you respond. And most of the time, that choice is silence, not the bitter kind, not the kind that hopes they notice, but the kind that says, "My peace is worth more than your chaos." When someone is used to pulling your strings, used to reading your emotional weather and adjusting their tactics accordingly, your silence becomes terrifying. Not knowing what you're thinking, how you're feeling, or where you stand creates a tension they can't manipulate. And that tension becomes your edge. They panic, not because they love you, but because they've lost the power they once held over you. When you used to react, you fed them energy, you gave them proof they mattered. But when you stop reacting, when you become a wall of stillness and intention, you remove their fuel, you remove their influence. You reclaim the narrative. And that is when the real transformation begins. Not when you say you've let go, not when you act detached, but when your inner world no longer flinches at the sound of their name, when your hands don't tremble when their message pops up, when you read it and feel nothing. That nothingness is not emptiness, it's fullness. It's the fullness of having returned to yourself. You don't owe them a response. You don't owe them access to your emotions. You don't owe them any explanation. What you owe is to yourself, to guard your peace, to walk in clarity, to protect the stillness you fought to reclaim. They once had the ability to disrupt you, to pull you back into their orbit with ease. Now they are left spinning in confusion because you've stopped playing. You're no longer in the ring. You've transcended the dynamic completely. That's the moment when reaction dies and response becomes your weapon. Their absence stops feeling like a loss. In the beginning, their absence feels unbearable. It's not just quiet, it's deafening. The silence is heavy, it lingers in your day like a shadow. Every little thing reminds you of them. The way they used to say your name, the late night conversations, the inside jokes, the habits and patterns that became part of your daily rhythm. The morning coffee feels incomplete, the empty bed feels colder, and time stretches longer in their absence. Your mind keeps playing those scenes on repeat because it's still trying to understand how someone who was once everything could suddenly become nothing. The brain seeks meaning, the heart seeks comfort, and both turn that silence into pain. You mistake that pain for proof that you've lost something irreplaceable. You see their absence as a wound, something bleeding slowly into your life, distorting every memory, every thought. But as the days pass, and you resist the urge to fill the space they left behind with distractions or rebound connections, something begins to shift. Slowly, the silence starts to breathe with you instead of suffocating you. You realize that the pain wasn't about them, it was about what their presence symbolized. Maybe it was connection, maybe it was validation, maybe it was the illusion of safety, but it was never really about them as a person. It was about the emotional pattern you had attached to them. And when you sit in that realization long enough, the echo of their absence begins to change its tone. The sting turns into spaciousness. The emptiness becomes a blank canvas, a new beginning, rather than a gaping void. You start to notice moments of peace creeping in. Moments when you're not thinking about them. Moments when you smile and it isn't forced. Moments when the day flows and you're not anchored in sadness. Those moments grow, they multiply, and eventually you understand something profound. Their absence isn't something to mourn. It's something that freed you, because when they left, they took the drama, the confusion, the instability with them. And in that space they left behind, you found clarity. Space is not just emptiness, it's opportunity. Opportunity to grow, to rebuild, to rediscover who you are without needing to be defined through someone else's attention or affection. It's in that quiet space where you begin confronting the parts of yourself that depended on them. The wounds you ignored, the voids you tried to fill, the patterns that kept you tethered. And when you stop resisting that inner work, when you stop running from the discomfort of solitude, you realize it's not loneliness you're facing, it's liberation. You're no longer attached to the idea that they completed you. You're beginning to see that you were always whole, even when you were hurting. They didn't add to you, They only distracted you from the parts of yourself you weren't ready to face. Now you have the space to do that. Stoicism reminds us that nothing external truly belongs to us. Not attention, not love, not even people. The more we anchor our peace in someone else, the more power we give them to disrupt it. When you depended on their presence to feel grounded, you handed over the keys to your emotional stability. But letting go means taking those keys back. It means no longer depending on anyone outside of you to feel whole, seen, or safe. You stop looking for the next message, the next apology, the next attempt to pull you back. You stop scanning the horizon for signs of their return. You look inward instead. You make your peace your priority, and your boundaries become non-negotiable. And what happens next is something they never anticipated. The emotional pull they used to rely on to keep you orbiting their world is gone. The energy they used to tap into, the validation they once drained from you, it's no longer available. You're not bitter, but you're inaccessible. You're not holding a grudge, but you've built a wall of self-respect that they can't climb. And the silence, the one that used to torment you, now torments them. Because it's not just quiet anymore, it's void of access. They don't know where you stand. They don't know if you still care. They don't know if you've replaced them or if you've simply outgrown them. And that mystery is louder than any argument, any plea, any cry for attention. Your detachment, once rooted in pain, has transformed into strength. You no longer see them as someone you lost. You see them as someone you no longer need. And that subtle yet seismic shift is irreversible. You're not the same. You're not waiting. You're not aching. You're building. You're grounded. You're free. Their absence was never a loss. It was the doorway to everything you were meant to become. You realize peace is better than proof. In the beginning, your mind becomes obsessed with being understood. It circles endlessly around the need for clarity, for them to acknowledge the harm they caused, for them to see your pain and validate your experience. You want them to get it, to own it, to come forward and offer the kind of apology that makes the pain worth it. You want to show them everything they missed, to lay out the evidence, to prove that you were never the problem. You think that if you could just explain it the right way, if they could just see things from your side, it would all make sense. It would bring peace. But what you're really chasing isn't peace. It's control disguised as healing. It's the need to make someone who didn't value you finally see your worth. This desire for proof becomes a loop. You might not even realize how much of your energy is being consumed by trying to win a battle that ended long ago. You replay conversations, you dissect their words, you write texts you never send, you imagine confrontations that never happen. You tell yourself that when they finally understand what they did, when they feel the guilt you carry, you'll be able to let go. But the reality is, proof never brings closure. Proof is not healing. Even if they gave you every answer, even if they admitted every fault, it wouldn't take away the pain. It wouldn't undo the neglect, the betrayal, the silence. Because proof doesn't rewrite the past. It only extends your connection to someone who has already let go. At some point, you stop needing to be seen by the person who ignored you. You stop hoping for apologies from someone who couldn't even offer honesty. You stop craving validation from the very hands that let you fall. You begin to understand that the need for proof is just another way of staying tethered. It's another version of waiting. Waiting to be heard, waiting to be respected, waiting to be understood. But healing doesn't happen in waiting. It happens in release. It happens in the quiet moment when you stop checking your phone, when you stop scanning their life for signs of regret, When you stop needing to prove your value to someone who was never equipped to recognize it, that's when you find peace, the real kind, the kind that doesn't shout or beg or seek, the kind that isn't dependent on anyone else's perception. It's not the kind of peace that needs closure, it is closure. It doesn't come from external validation, it grows from internal understanding. You realize that your experience is valid even if no one else ever acknowledges it. Your pain is real even if they deny it. And your healing is sacred even if they never witness it. You don't need to reframe the story. You don't need to fix the narrative. You don't need to be seen to move on. You let go of the obsession with proving anything to anyone. When you choose peace over proof, you drop the emotional armor. You stop rehearsing comebacks. You stop explaining yourself. You stop chasing justice from someone who lost the right to hear your truth. It's not about weakness, it's about mastery. It's about understanding that your worth isn't a debate. It's a fact, one that doesn't need to be presented, defended, or proven. You walk away not because you lost, but because you finally stopped lowering yourself to win something that was never worth fighting for in the first place. And when that shift happens, it disorients the other person, because they were prepared for the fight. They were used to the argument, the explanation, the emotional tug-of-war. They expected you to keep trying, to keep hoping, to keep engaging. They don't know what to do with your silence. It's unsettling because silence doesn't give them a role. It doesn't offer them power. It doesn't let them play the victim or the hero. It just exists. And in that stillness, they're left with themselves, with their guilt, their denial, their choices. You're no longer involved in their process. You've stepped away. Peace doesn't mean you've forgotten. It doesn't mean it didn't matter. It means you no longer need it to matter in their eyes. You've moved beyond the need for acknowledgement. You've recentered your energy on what actually heals you. And ironically, when you stop chasing the apology, when you stop needing to be proven right, you become the most powerful version of yourself. Because you no longer carry the burden of being understood, you carry the freedom of not needing to be. Peace over proof means you've let go, not just of the person, but of the version of yourself that kept begging for closure. You realize the apology you were waiting for was the one you gave yourself, when you decided to choose your well-being over their recognition. You no longer replay the story. At first, it's like you're trapped inside a movie that never ends. The scenes run on a loop in your head, uninvited, relentless, each frame dragging you back into the past. You relive the last conversation over and over, analyzing their tone, their facial expressions, the words they chose or didn't choose. You fixate on the shift you felt but couldn't explain, the way they started pulling away, how they became more distant without warning. You obsess over the moment they stopped choosing you. It becomes an emotional treadmill. You're running, exhausting yourself, but not moving forward. You're trapped in the narrative, trying to rewrite the ending in your mind, hoping that somehow it will make peace feel more attainable. You start blaming yourself. You wonder what you could have done differently. You search for signs you missed, for red flags you ignored, for reasons they changed. And in doing so, you tie yourself to someone who has already moved on. This mental loop isn't harmless. It slowly erodes your self-worth. It tricks you into believing that if you can just understand why it fell apart, the pain will dissolve. That if you can find the missing puzzle piece, the regret, the moment it all went wrong, you can finally let go. But that's a lie we tell ourselves when we're not ready to accept the truth. Not everything broken can be fixed, and not all endings come with answers. the more you replay the story, the more you stay emotionally invested in a version of reality that no longer exists. You're not healing, you're holding on, you're not reflecting, you're reattaching. Every time you hit mental rewind, you open the wound again, not to clean it, but to feel something, and feeling something becomes addictive, even when it hurts, because it's familiar. But healing begins when you finally stop pressing play, not because you got the resolution you wanted, not because they apologized, not because the ending suddenly makes sense, but because you finally recognize that the act of revisiting the pain is a form of self-sabotage. It keeps you locked in a time and space where you no longer belong. It robs you of the present, it blinds you to the future, and it anchors your identity to someone who is no longer part of your life. When you let the story end, not rewrite it, not romanticize it, not pretend it never mattered, but truly end it in your mind, that's when transformation begins. You stop trying to change what happened and instead start investing in what is. You realize that closure was never a gift someone else could give you. It was a decision you had to make for yourself. You no longer need to understand their reasons. You no longer need to make sense of their silence. You no longer obsess over the shift in their energy, because the truth is, clarity doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it comes with acceptance. Brutal, raw, unfiltered acceptance. Acceptance that they chose to stop choosing you. Acceptance that you were not the problem to solve, but the lesson they were too blind to learn. And when you accept reality exactly as it is, not dressed up, not watered down, you find clarity in the chaos. You see that all the mental reruns were just your way of avoiding the pain of now, because the now is honest. It's where the loss is real, the silence is unchangeable, and the future is up to you. Stoicism reminds us that we must accept life on its own terms. That means letting go of imagined outcomes and dealing with what is. It's not about being indifferent, it's about refusing to live in illusions. You stop negotiating with the past. You stop trying to bend time backward. You acknowledge what happened and, more importantly, what didn't happen, and then you stop trying to fix what's already gone. The old scenes still come back sometimes. They appear in dreams, in quiet moments, in sudden waves of nostalgia. But you don't engage with them anymore. You don't argue with them. You let them pass, like clouds drifting through your mental sky, noticed, but not clung to, observed, but not owned. From a psychological perspective, this is the moment where detachment deepens. You've cut the last string, the emotional tether that tied you to the fantasy of what could have been. You no longer need to revisit the pain to validate your experience. You no longer give the past the power to define your worth. The story, once a source of suffering, becomes a memory that no longer wounds. And even more than that, it becomes a turning point. Because when you stop living in the memory, you start living in your mission. You channel all the energy that once went into analyzing the past into creating your future. You write new pages, new paths, new standards. You stop asking why it happened to you and start asking what it awakened in you. And that's when the real change begins, not when the past is erased, but when it no longer owns you, when it no longer defines your mood, your decisions, or your identity. You're not a victim of your memories anymore. You're the author of your evolution. You're no longer trapped in a loop. You're moving forward. The story ends not with closure from them, but with power reclaimed by you. And when you finally close that chapter, you realize the past didn't destroy you. It refined you. It didn't define your worth. It revealed it. You don't rewrite the ending. You write a new beginning. One where the main character isn't chasing what was lost, but becoming who they were always meant to be. You break the emotional leash. There was a time when their presence, their absence, their mood swings, and even their silence had complete control over you. You didn't realize it at the time, but you were emotionally tethered to someone who knew exactly how to pull your strings. With one text, they could disrupt your peace. With one vague message or a flash of nostalgia, they could reel you back in. A subtle move, a memory posted, a breadcrumb dropped. They knew how to manipulate your mind. And the worst part, you allowed it, not because you were weak, but because you were still emotionally invested. You wanted answers, you wanted clarity, you wanted hope, so you gave them access again and again, mistaking familiarity for connection and manipulation for attention. You were on a leash, and you weren't even aware of how often you handed it to them. Every time you responded when you knew you shouldn't, every time you broke no contact, every time you checked their profile, reread old messages, fantasized about the day they'd come back and finally get it. That leash wasn't around your neck physically, but mentally, spiritually, emotionally. You were bound. They didn't even have to fight for control. They already had it, and they knew it. They could vanish for days, weeks, and show up with a simple "hey," and suddenly your world was off balance again. That's how powerful the emotional leash was, not because they were special, but because you still hadn't reclaimed your power. But something shifts, slowly at first. You begin to see the patterns. You notice how every time you respond, you lose a little more of yourself. You begin to recognize the energy drain, the way your mood depends on their engagement, the way your focus scatters when they're near, the way your peace disappears when they're silent. You get tired, not just of them, but of yourself, tired of falling for the same tricks, tired of feeling like you're not in control of your own mind, tired of giving them power they didn't earn and don't deserve. And in that exhaustion, something beautiful begins to happen. You begin to detach, not out of anger, not as a tactic, but as a form of spiritual self-rescue. You don't make a big announcement. You don't threaten them with absence. You don't post cryptic quotes hoping they'll see it and finally realize what they've lost. You simply go quiet, not because you're hiding, but because you've decided that your energy is no longer available for their games. You let go of the leash, the one they used to pull every time they needed a dose of attention, or a moment of control, or proof that they still mattered. You drop it, and when you do, the silence becomes your sanctuary. Now, when they reach out, you don't respond. Not because you're bitter, but because you've already said everything that needed to be said in your absence. You don't explain yourself, you don't argue, you don't try to make them understand, because deep down you've accepted that someone who had access to your heart and still played games was never interested in healing with you. They were interested in control, and control requires access, but now that access is revoked permanently, Stoicism teaches that control over one's emotions is not just strength, it's freedom. The ability to choose your response, or to choose no response at all, is the highest form of power. When you no longer feel the urge to respond to their chaos, when you no longer need to defend your decision to walk away, when you no longer look to their behavior for validation or clarity, you've broken the chain. You're not triggered anymore, you're not waiting, you're not reacting, you're just observing, and from that place of observation you rise, and what they don't expect is the lack of response, because before, every action of theirs triggered a reaction from you. They could rely on your attention, on your forgiveness, on your presence. They expected it, they needed it. It was their source of significance. But now, the silence is louder than any scream. You don't ask why. You don't beg them to stay, you don't even flinch. They're left with their words echoing into a void, their guilt bouncing back at them, their games falling flat. because without your emotional participation, they have nothing left to work with. You've cut the invisible thread, the spiritual hook, the subtle emotional contract that said, "You can hurt me and I'll still be here." That contract is void, not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself more. More than the fantasy, more than the hope, more than the illusion that they'd change. You're no longer the puppet, and they're no longer the puppeteer. They can no longer reach into your life and shake it just to feel powerful. They can no longer drain your energy just to feel relevant. You've created a barrier they cannot cross, not a wall of bitterness, but a boundary of peace. From a dark psychology perspective, this is the ultimate blow to anyone who once held emotional control over you. Because manipulation thrives on response, on emotion, on weakness disguised as attachment. But now, you've removed all three. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need closure. You don't even need them to feel regret. Because none of it matters anymore. What matters is the peace that lives in your body, in your decisions, in your silence. You've evolved. You're not the same man who once bent backward for crumbs. You're not the same person who begged to be seen. That version of you, the one who flinched at their silence and broke at their distance, is gone. You've built a new version, one that doesn't respond out of emotion, but moves out of intention. One that doesn't hope for change, but becomes the change. You no longer react, you reflect. You no longer wait, you walk. You don't chase, you choose, and the choice is you. The leash is gone, and with it, the illusion that someone else's behavior dictates your worth. You've stepped out of the cage of their influence, and in doing so, you've found something greater than love, greater than closure, greater than any answer they could have given. You've found your freedom. Their guilt has nowhere to land. When you truly let go emotionally, mentally, spiritually, it creates a shift not only within you but also within the person who once held power over your emotions. Before, they had an unspoken comfort in knowing they could return to you, that your heart remained an open door they could walk through whenever it served their need for validation, control, or attention. They might not have acknowledged it consciously, but somewhere deep down, they carried the assurance that if guilt ever surfaced, they could offload it onto you. Maybe with a message, maybe with a subtle breadcrumb, maybe with a manipulative apology that wasn't meant to heal, but to relieve themselves of the discomfort they avoided. You were their emotional cushion, the place they could dump their regret, their shame, their missteps, and feel temporarily lighter. They didn't take responsibility for their actions. They transferred the emotional weight onto you. But something happens when you remove yourself from the emotional equation entirely. You become inaccessible, not in a dramatic way, not with loud declarations of "I'm done," but with a stillness so profound it cannot be penetrated. You don't react to their messages. You don't respond to their attempts to reconnect. You don't leave the window cracked open for closure or future possibilities. You close the door softly but firmly, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of self-respect. And in doing so, you rob them of the mechanism they once relied on to avoid facing themselves. You were their mirror, but now that mirror is gone, and the only reflection left for them to confront is their own. This is when guilt begins to take root, not the superficial kind they can brush off with excuses or distractions, but the kind that festers, the kind that lingers in the quiet moments, late at night when the distractions have faded, when there's no audience to perform for, when the truth sits beside them with no escape. That guilt grows not because you made them feel it, but because they finally have no one else to project it onto. They try to reach for you, maybe through a message cloaked in false concern, maybe through silence they hope you'll break, but nothing comes back. No emotional reaction, no explanation, no anger, just distance. Just peace, just a vacuum where they once dumped their shame. You used to carry their guilt for them. Every time they twisted a story to make you the villain. Every time they played victim to avoid accountability. Every time they made you question your own perception, your own emotions, your own worth. You absorbed it. You doubted yourself. You softened your stance just to keep the peace. But now, with the emotional distance you've created, there's nowhere for that guilt to go. It doesn't disappear, it ricochets. It sits in them like a stone in the stomach. They may not even understand it at first, but they feel it. Restlessness, irritability, regret they don't know how to soothe. Because you, the one who used to absorb their consequences, are no longer there. Stoicism reminds us that we are not responsible for the burdens other people refuse to carry. You don't owe anyone your emotional space, especially those who violated it. When you stop showing up for their self-justification rituals, you force them to face the weight of their own choices. You no longer serve as their relief. You don't play therapist. You don't entertain their confusion. You've stopped allowing your compassion to be a landing pad for their dysfunction, and in doing so, you have taken away the tool they used most effectively, your empathy. They can no longer weaponize your kindness to avoid accountability. From a dark psychology perspective, this kind of emotional cutoff is devastating to someone who relies on manipulating your reactions. Because when someone can no longer access your emotional world, they lose more than attention. They lose their shield. Guilt without projection becomes self-directed. It turns into anxiety, into insomnia, into an internal storm that has no shelter. Not because you're punishing them, but because they're finally being introduced to themselves. The version of them you kept trying to understand, fix, or save. And now, there's no one left to play that role. They might try to blame you again. They might twist the story in their head to make you the cold one, the unfeeling one, the one who walked away. But none of that works anymore, because deep down they know. They know what they did. They know what they failed to do. They know who they became in the process. And the silence you give them doesn't confirm their narrative, it contradicts it. If you had truly been the problem, they wouldn't feel this unsettled by your peace. If you were the villain in their story, they wouldn't need you to respond in order to feel better. Your stillness is a verdict they can't appeal. They sit with it, day after day, and the longer your silence stretches, the louder their guilt becomes. Not because you're holding it over them, but because you've let it go, and that, more than anything, forces them to finally hold it themselves. You're no longer responsible for softening their landing. You don't cushion their fall with your forgiveness. You don't give them closure. You let them experience the full consequence of their own behavior. You've taken your power back not by lashing out, but by disappearing into your peace. And now they are haunted, not by what you said, but by what you didn't. Not by your presence, but by your absence. Not by your anger, but by your stillness. Because guilt without a landing place doesn't vanish, it multiplies. And while you've moved forward, they're left circling the same questions you once asked yourself. But the difference is you've found answers, you've found healing, you've found clarity, and they're just now beginning to feel what it's like to be on the other side of silence, holding the full weight of everything they never had the courage to own. And now, without a word, without a fight, without a final plea, you've taken your energy back and stepped out of the loop. You're no longer tangled in their chaos, no longer tethered to the need for closure. no longer available for emotional recycling. Your silence has become your boundary. Your peace has become your statement. And your absence has become their mirror. You didn't let go to punish them. You let go to free yourself. And in that quiet release, you discovered what they never could give you: clarity, wholeness, and power. You don't need them to feel the weight of your worth. You already know what it is.